Hi everybody and welcome to the Payment Genes podcast series Voices in Payments. I'm your host Diederik Klopper, and in this podcast series we will talk about the recent developments in the payment industry. Today we are joined by Siamac Rezaiezadeh, and he's the head of product marketing at GoCardless. GoCardless is on a mission to simplify getting paid for businesses with recurring revenue models. With Siamac we will talk subscription payments, recurring payments and invoice payments. Hello and welcome to Voices in Payments, the payment podcast by Payment Genes. Today I, Diederik Klopper, your host, am joined by Siamac Rezaiezadeh, and he is the head of product marketing at GoCardless. Siamac, a very warm welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here, Diederik. Really pleased to be here, and thanks for having me.
All right. Hey, Siamac, we had a short discussion beforehand, and I mentioned to you that I never met a payment expert who woke up one day and said, I want to be a payment expert. How did you stumble into payments?
Yeah, so I guess it's a relatively interesting story. So I actually used to work for a mobile messaging company who effectively helped other companies send text messages to their customers. So think about all of the text messages you get from the likes of DHL when you've got a delivery that's due that day. And part of their technology stack actually included enabling people to charge or make mobile payments, and that was specifically to put payments onto their mobile phone bill. So that was kind of my first kind of foray into the world of payments as such.
In carrier billing.
In carrier billing, exactly. And so started to kind of, I guess, cut my teeth in that area, which is a really interesting area in the sense that has some really unique elements. So things like conversion can be really high, but obviously the underlying costs of the transaction are relatively high as well. So you kind of you learn to operate in really specific and unique niches. So that's kind of where I kind of got started, and learned to appreciate quite, that there are different ways of collecting a payment, and they can have very unique advantages to a business or to a customer, and some very unique disadvantages to a business or a customer. That's kind of how I got started, and that was probably 10 years ago at this point, maybe more, 11, 12 years ago. Kind of worked at that company for 7 years, then went off and did some things on my own for a few years, and then ended up at GoCardless, introduced to me by actually a former colleague at that very company. I'd actually completely forgotten about that, who had since also joined GoCardless. Introduced GoCardless to me, and was super impressed with the opportunity and the things that they were trying to do from a payments perspective, and so thought, hey, well, let's get back into it then.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Talking about GoCardless, tell us a little bit more about the company and what you guys are trying to do.
I think about the problem that we're solving quite a lot, and how best to how to articulate some of the pains that people have. And I've talked to, I guess, hundreds of different businesses and companies and people around the world about this over the last few years, and really it comes down to over the last let's say 15 years or so, there's been a huge kind of revolution in the way that companies operate. More and more businesses have switched to recurring revenue business models. So what started off in kind of SaaS and software in the early noughties has now turned into subscription boxes, and getting my Harry's razors delivered on a monthly basis, and pet food delivered, and everything's kind of moving to this recurring revenue business model. For a number of reasons, it's great from a revenue perspective, but I also think it's great because you really get to understand your customers and how to develop a relationship with them. So more and more companies moving to this recurring revenue business model. But then what that then means is that there's the number of recurring payments actually has dramatically increased in the same period as well. And that might be subscription payments, it might be invoice payments, or it might be installments. And we kind of think about those as being three different types of recurring payments, which kind of exist in along these business models. But then what happens is that, or what, what GoCardless saw was that, these businesses and organizations who are trying to collect these recurring payments kind of try to use payment methods which weren't necessarily optimized for recurring payments. So there's been a ton of innovation in payments, as you well know, over the last 10 years. Some really interesting companies doing some really clever and impressive things. But the world of recurring payments has kind of been underserved. And this is kind of manifests itself in a number of ways, where you see, we were just talking about it right before, where you see the vast majority of B2B invoices between payments between companies for ongoing services such as let's say accounting or legal fees and so on, still paid for by a monthly bank transfer or a monthly check that kind of gets sent out. And that causes an awful lot of problems for both sides of the business, right? So if you're the seller, you have to figure out some way to manually reconcile that payment every single month. Those payments might have mistakes in them because they're manually pushed by your customer. They tend to be relatively late. Overall, companies tend to end up either on purpose or just by human nature, tend to pay later than expected, which causes cash flow problems. And ultimately it costs a lot of money to try and recover a lot of those payments and get them in on time. And this is just because we're using check or a bank transfer, which is fine for a one-off payment, but less fine for a recurring payment. And then at the other end of the scale, you've got things like credit cards and debit cards, which great, serve an absolute purpose as part of the payment mix, but suffer from some pretty structural problems when it comes to recurring payments. Particularly things like if you're a business accepting a monthly subscription for your service, anything from 10 to 15% of your payments will fail on the first attempt via a credit card. It fail for a number of reasons: either your customer's out of money or has insufficient funds, or the issuing bank will block the transaction for some unknown reason, or their card will have expired. And these cause real problems in the sense that then if you're doing this at scale, let's say you've got 100 million customers around the world, you're talking about millions and millions of payments every single month that you have to try and recover in some way, and ultimately some proportion of them churn.
Yeah, which causes frustration as well on the customer side.
Yeah, and so on the customer side, you've got losing access to service. You've got having to update your card details. Let's say you have to, if you're sending a check every month, it's a cost in your business that you're having to account for somewhere. So there's a ton of costs on the customer side, a ton of costs on the seller side, and some of them are direct and some of them are indirect, and it all stems from the fact that there's no kind of optimal way of kind of collecting recurring payments at scale. So that's the problem that GoCardless set out to solve, and what we're making, I think, pretty decent headway doing.
Yeah, indeed. He mentioned as well that had a lot of payments, recurring payments, subscription payments fail. Before I joined Payment Genes and got into payments, I thought that this was one of the most rigid payment methods, and it would always succeed because everybody knows it's coming. When I dove into it, I found a lot of hidden treasures as to what makes it a lot more complicated. What are some of the key things that you guys are seeing that causes a lot of failed transactions?
Sure. I mean, so you've got the full kind of spectrum from human error to payment method error to kind of structural problems. So if you look at something like a credit card transaction, a common one is, I mean, obviously, one that's kind of common across the board is that the end customer has insufficient funds on that particular day that you're trying to take that transaction, and it's a difficult one to solve for, but there's definitely ways that you can solve for it in different ways. Credit cards actually expiring, or the payment method in general kind of no longer being available, is another big reason. As people subscribe to services, their situation changes, and they just something might happen. They lose their credit card, or they close down their bank account, or their credit card gets just expires, and so these are pretty common kind of account close reasons that make up a decent proportion. Obviously, different payment methods have various differences between that kind of account close. Obviously, you close your account at a much lower frequency than you might replace your credit card, for example. Right through to things like the issuing bank or the payer's bank decides to deny or block or not honor the transaction which can be for a variety of reasons, right?
Yeah.
Those are kind of the common reasons, leaving aside, of course, human error, which is still relatively widespread as well.
Yeah. And then taking through to GoCardless, so how does your solution solve this problem?
Sure.
Or
So
these problems,
yeah,
multiple.
so the way that we kind of look, and then obviously this is these are kind of some of the core structural problems of recurring payments. So there's a few others that we could work through as well, but we looked at kind of the market and kind of you can make an assessment and say, okay, what is the best way to collect a recurring payment? How do you remove as many of these shortcomings as possible? And if you look at it, the most effective two levers that I think you have are, number one is that as the seller, the merchant should be in control of the transaction. So rather than leaving it up to the payer effectively to send you money, it's up to the merchant to decide the time and place at which they can pull the money from the bank account, so that they're in control of when that happens. So that's kind of number one. And then number two is then where do you pull that money from, or how do you kind of pull that money? And the way to avoid a lot of the structural problems with recurring payments is to pull directly from the bank account. So you're not then dependent on third parties sitting in the middle who might experience a technical problem. You're not dependent on, let's say, a wallet which is has a few different payment methods which are configured by the payer. You're not dependent on all those kind of things that I mentioned about credit cards failing. You're kind of limiting the possibility to error down to like its kind of base place. Where is the money? In the bank accounts, that's where I'm going to kind of draw it from. And so the thing that we did is we looked, you can look at, how do you kind of pull those things together and see that actually there is a payment mechanism that exists out in the wild, which does exactly that, right? It enables businesses to pull funds from their customers' bank accounts directly at the time and place of their choosing. We call it Bax Direct Debit in the UK. It's called ACH Debit in the US. It's called Pre-Authorized Debit in Canada. It's called lots of different things, but around the world. But it fundamentally enables people to do that. So that's kind of how we thought about the problem and said, okay, well, how can we enable companies, large and small, to be able to kind of collect funds from their customers' bank accounts using this payment mechanism, or at least a derivative of it from the start, basically.
Yeah, and based on that, I can as well imagine that the possibilities that PSD2 and open banking offer, through an API integration, having insights into the revenue streams that will go on the bank account of the consumer, perhaps that will as well assist you in timing when to deduct the amount from the bank account. Is that something that you guys are working on?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, there are some, I'd say that there are some really key, interesting things that you can do with kind of new, payment and banking APIs, such as open banking. You kind of hit the nail on the head there with one of them, is in the sense that by having greater access to being able to look at someone's account history, for example, or be able to look into someone's account, you'd be able to see when and where they have the funds in their account to kind of make those decisions. However, it's not necessarily the only way of doing that, right? There's lots of different ways you can kind of make some of those decisions, and in fact, I'm sure we can talk about it at a point. But GoCardless has just released a new product which addresses Success Plus, exactly, which addresses that specific problem, but from a slightly different angle.
Yeah. And one of the key things as well that a failed recurring payment or subscription payment will bring along is, you mentioned it previously, losing access to the service. Of course, this is an interesting topic because head merchants, in most cases, are responsible for coming up with the policy that they put in place when a payment is unsuccessful. But as well, from your perspective, do you have any tips or tricks or insights or thoughts? What works best from a subscription payment perspective? So, for instance, if I'm using Netflix, SoundCloud, Spotify, you name it, and my payment is unsuccessful, at the moment I'm granted a grace period so that I can still use the services even though my payment was denied. What are the key things that you are seeing in the market that really work well in making sure that eventually you can collect the money?
Yeah, and and by collecting money, continue to give the user access to the
Exactly.
service that they have, right? And you talk about the problem, that it might be Spotify or SoundCloud, which you or I might think are mission critical to our lives. But if I don't have my Spotify account tomorrow, I'll probably be okay. Although maybe not for 2 or 3 days in a row, that might be a bit more taxing. But if you think about it. From a mission critical perspective or from a business perspective, these could be critical services if you're
Accounting
running
software.
ads on any one of the big platforms, right, that drive your entire business, and you get those ads paused for a week or 2 weeks whilst you've got an unpaid bill. That's actual meaningful revenue loss to your own business if those ads are driving your business. Likewise with accounting software, as you mentioned, or something similar to AWS or Google Cloud Platform, or any one of the kind of similar services out there, which are which companies are built on, right? Like these aren't nice to haves; they're fundamental.
No.
So yeah, look, I mean, there's a few ways out there that people kind of think about those problems, right? So the way that I've seen people look at it is you almost have like a chain of activities or actions that can take place, right? So let's say that once you try to take the payment, let's say that that payment then fails. You've then got some sort of what I think of as an automated recovery process. And then once that fails, you've then got a manual recovery process. And then once that fails, you've kind of got either a churn event or a collect or some other kind of debt recovery process or something like that. And you can kind of think about solutions to this problem at every stage along that kind of 4-step pathway. How do you make the initial payment more likely to be successful? How do you make the automated recovery part more likely to be successful? How do you make the manual recovery part more likely to be successful? And then if ultimately you do get to a churn event or something similar, how do you kind of recover that customer in some way? And we ultimately think that certainly the most effective ways at solving some of these problems that I've seen are the ones that tend towards the start of that process, right? So the nearer that you can get to the start, the more successful you'll be.
It's also more scalable if you can focus on the automation part then versus the manual labor part.
Yes, exactly. So then you kind of break it down and you look at, okay, well, the automation part, like what are the things you can automate, right? You can automate emails to Diederik to say, hey, you're about to lose access to Spotify. We've given you a grace period of 7 days, but unless you kind of update your payment details, then we're going to cut off service. So that's one way to kind of semi-automate things, but it's still kind of very dependent on you still taking a manual action, right? The way that we've certainly addressed the problem with Success Plus, which we launched a couple of months ago now, is to say that in our world with GoCardless, that first of all the probability of the first failure is relatively low, certainly relative compared to other payment mechanisms that are out there. So you kind of already solved part of the problem there. But let's just assume that it does get into this kind of automated recovery process. What you really want to be able to do is say, let's say you're doing something straightforward like retrying a payment. Traditionally that retry strategy, let's say that the vast majority of your payments kind of fail due to insufficient funds, right? In our case, it's something like 80% of GoCardless payments fail because of insufficient funds. So the thing that you're really optimizing for is, when is it likely that the customer will have money in their bank account, as opposed to some other measure, which might be, when is it likely that they will have updated their card details, for example. And so the retry strategy that you then need to kind of think about is how do you optimize your retries such that you're more likely to hit a date when they have money in their bank account, basically. And traditionally, kind of retry strategies will be relatively, either the next possible day, or relatively arbitrary based on a few rules that people have decided. Maybe every third day we'll retry the payment. But we think actually taking a more of I think the best kind of the optimal strategy is to think about what is best for the individual customer. When is Diederik more likely to have money in his bank account versus when is Siamac more likely to have money in his bank account? And then by taking that into account, you can build a more efficient and optimal retry strategy, which ultimately increases the probability that you'll be successful, which ultimately means that you'll have a better customer experience for everybody.
And this is the smart retry proposition that you guys have with Success Plus.
Yeah, exactly. So Success Plus is an overall product which aims to kind of help merchants manage and reduce failures. And intelligent retries is this first feature, which is exactly that, right? It uses all of the kind of payments intelligence that we have about specific payment schemes, countries, industries, individuals, and kind of set some machine learning models loose onto that data set to say, okay, what is the probability of success of a retry on day one? What is the probability of retry success on day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7? And then for
build on the data.
Exactly. And for Diederik, it will say, right, actually a retry strategy of day 7, day 15, and day 28 is the best possible kind of the optimal way of getting the highest chance of success, basically.
Yeah. And then to take it back, in the beginning you mentioned that 15 years ago, the whole subscription recurring payment infrastructure basically was redesigned, and that a lot of companies were implementing such payment methods with using payment methods that were perhaps not suitable, like credit cards for those solutions. Do you see any current developments or trends in business model that are based on subscription or recurring payments that are perhaps more in line with the available payment options out there? Or is there anything that companies with such business models can do that will enable them to have a higher success rates in their payment setup?
So let me just see if I understand the question. So are there things that companies can do today to kind of make
basically if my company either B2B or B2C, if I have a subscription or recurring business model, is there anything that I can do, for instance, changing to a weekly from weekly to monthly or monthly to quarterly or the other way around, those kind of things that will allow me to have a optimized payment strategy in that sense?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's different levers that you can look at that are outside of the payment method that you choose to use. Certainly, things like, I was doing some research on this last week that suggests pretty clearly, at least when it comes to bank debit, that the lower the average transaction value, the more likely payment is to go through, right? Which kind of stands to reason in the sense that if the vast majority of payment failures in the bank debit world are due to insufficient funds, the lower the payment amount, the more likely it is to kind of go through. So certainly, if you can lower the average transaction value, the more likely you are to see payment success. So that's certainly one avenue to definitely think about. There's an interesting kind of debate about monthly versus quarterly versus annual payments, which I think I'm actually very keen to do a lot more research on. I think that there has been some already, which is not necessarily conclusive in any one direction. I've certainly seen circumstances where paying monthly looks like it reduces the probability of failure and reduces customer churn. Likewise, for other types of services, I've seen kind of annual or quarterly payments have a lower churn rate as well. So I've kind of seen a mixture of both. I think the jury is kind of out at the moment, but I'm definitely keen to do a little bit more research on that. But I think that ultimately, you are looking at kind of what are those levers, right? So how much, what is your average transaction value? If you can lower it, it's more likely to be successful.
Would
And
it
then
be industry specific, for instance? That could
yeah,
also be a case.
yeah, and that, yeah. So you might
And I
look.
think there will be a vast difference between B2B and B2C in that case as well.
So the natural split would be B2B, B2C,
Yeah.
and then industry specific. The other thing to think about as well, though, is how do you kind of prepare your customers for bills and payments that are upcoming. So is there there's an argument to say in some worlds that not telling a customer that they've got a bill coming up is a good thing, because they might just forget about it, which may very well be true. I'm not necessarily sure it's the best longer term strategy, but certainly if you're notifying customers upfront, especially for slightly larger payments, that there's a payment going to come out of your account in the next 3 days, let's say, that has a tendency also to kind of lower the failure rate, particularly on the consumer side, I think.
Yeah. In that regards, recently Netflix announced that they will discontinue the recurring payments for non-active users, so people who are still paying but don't actively use the service. Do you see this happening more often, or do you have any insights there?
I don't know, actually. It kind of depends on the service, I think. Right. So I'm just trying to think, if I'm a Netflix user, and let's say they arbitrarily say, if you haven't used the service for 3 months, we're going to kind of remove access from the service and stop collecting payment from you. I don't know how I would necessarily feel if I woke up
If
one
you
morning.
also don't have access to the service once
Yeah,
you log in again.
precisely. Like, I think it's difficult to judge people's intentions, and I think for some types of services it's a little clearer. The Netflix one is probably, I might be being a little bit facetious. I wouldn't be too annoyed, and I could pretty easily kind of turn it back on when I wanted to use it. Something very different would be for things which you kind of you don't necessarily use every day, but you depend on, and will you depend on being available when you do need them, basically.
Well, for instance, insurance claims, they are in the Netherlands. They're automatically continued over the year's end, without any notice. But I think these are exactly the things that perhaps could be discontinued by mistake, for instance.
Exactly.
And then you're in a whole heap of trouble.
So it's kind of like at the moment we have this concept in the subscription world of churn being either voluntary or involuntary. Voluntary being I don't want this service anymore, I'm going to cancel it. Involuntary being oops, I missed that payment and the merchant cancelled it for me. We're now then introducing this kind of third category, which is kind of forced involuntary, which is a decision made by the merchant based on usage, as opposed to their payments kind of being successful, which I think introduces a certain element of risk. I don't know, how would you feel if you woke up one morning and you needed to file an insurance claim and you found out that you were unable to because you no longer had insurance?
Well, indeed, those are the thing. There's a huge distinction there between indeed critical and non-critical services. Who is to make the decision whether something's critical or not for me? If I have a family with 4 kids, I might assume that Netflix is more critical than if I'm just by myself with my girlfriend. Those are 2 different things. It will grant you a lot of extra sleep hours if you can still have the service with the kids. Indeed, that's very interesting. And what I was wondering is if there's a role for the payment industry to play a role there. So should indeed involuntary churn, a merchant can keep on collecting their funds through many months onwards. But is there a role for the payment service provider or the payment industry as a whole to say, listen, okay, for these type of services or for this merchant or this consumer, we only will allow a grace period of X, Y, Z, for instance. I think that's also quite interesting to see.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I mean, one of I guess on a slightly related area, I certainly see a role for the payments industry to make it easy for merchants to kind of pause subscriptions for their customers, where they see that there might be a valid reason for doing so. Really good, really relevant example right now is we work like many other payments companies with lots of gyms and fitness studios and so on, who've over the last 3 or 4 months, had to pause a lot of their subscriptions and do that in a really easy and seamless way. And I think that by offering them the tools to put those on hold rather than cancel them completely, is for the benefit of all the parties involved. And giving people the tools to do that is something on the payments industry to do, and so it's certainly something that GoCardless enables as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great service. This is indeed one of the examples that will have a great use case for that. Did you as well see a huge increase in these type of companies approaching GoCardless with for these type of solutions?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's no secret that lots of companies like gyms and fitness studios and so on have gone through pretty tough times over the last few months. Have had to pause and think about how they manage their business, and for the ones that GoCardless supports, we're happy to be able to support them basically in the ways that we can. And hopefully the ways that we've enabled that will enable them to kind of get back to business as soon as they can. So certainly, yes.
Yeah. Another thing that we see with quite a few of merchants that we're supporting is that, for instance, if we're looking at the challenger banking landscape, which is all about accumulating as high market share as possible, getting new signups, there's quite a huge demand in referrals, for instance, from existing clients. In that sense, I can as well imagine that, for instance, I'm paying a monthly subscription for a service, but if I'm actively soliciting other users to use that service as well, that perhaps my fee will be deduced. Is it something that you guys are seeing in the market? Is it something that you're working on?
So certainly not from our side. I think there's a few interesting parts in there.
So basically, what I can imagine. So, for instance, Revolut, they are super aggressive in obtaining more market share and getting more usage in. And I know that they as well give cash out bonuses to, and for this service they put it in your bank account because that's for them the easiest solution. However, for instance, Netflix subscribers or Deliveroo or Uber or whatever, they're as well still quite aggressive in their promotion. At the moment, they provide that in giving discounts for your next purchase. But perhaps for the business models where it's fully on subscription payments, it's not that easy to settle that in the next invoice for an extra service consumed.
Yes and no. So I'm thinking of a few examples now where we certainly work with a number of energy companies who offer a very similar model, right? So they offer, if you refer a friend to kind of join the energy company, then you get a credit of kind of whatever it is. And certainly what that credit then is applied against your account, and your future invoice payments are then reduced, either by a proportionate amount every month or just the whole amount until you're kind of back out of credit. I think that the key there is that so I think it's not only possible but eminently doable. I see it in the market quite frequently. But the key is that you have to have as a business, you have to have a billing system that's flexible enough to be able to change those invoices effectively, right? So on the subscription side, if your billing system is pretty fixed and says, right, this is a £10 or €10 a month transaction, and there's no deviation from that, then you're in trouble. And you can't do that. So you need the flexibility to do that, and then you need the flexibility to with your payment provider or payment processor to be able to say, I need you to be able to effectively process the amount that I tell you to process, not just like what you think it should be every single month or something like that. So you kind of need those two things joined up, and if you've got that, then I think you're in a really good place. I mean, it's very similar to, not just in terms of discounts, but there's some great research by Zuora, who operate a global billing platform, that demonstrates that SaaS companies, for example, that enable their users to kind of upgrade and downgrade at will, and kind of offer, more flexibility in terms of what they can buy and what they get access to on a monthly basis, end up making more revenue overall than SaaS companies who are kind of rigid in their pricing models and what users can do. So I think that it's kind of a related area. If you can enable that flexibility, whether it's in discounts or in usage fees and flexibility there, then I think you're more, if with that flexibility you can do more with it and hopefully generate more revenue.
With GoCardless, do you also facilitate? So, for instance, if I'm using for a B2B, if I'm using accounting software A, but I need more capabilities, so halfway through the month of May, I will as well select an add-on, which will cost extra per month. Do you as well offer the possibility there to split the payment or the surcharge that is requested? Or, for instance, if for Spotify you're going for premium or a family package, the date on which the service is activated does not always correspond with the date of the payment. So is that for you guys fully on the merchant side to activate the payment and we have the right amounts, or is that something that you take care of as well?
So on our side, we really we process effectively what we're requested to process, right? So if the merchant says to us, we want you to collect £10 a month from now on, then we collect £10 a month from now on. If the merchant says we want you to collect what we tell you to collect on a monthly basis, then that's kind of what we process. So that's kind of how we tend to operate it. Although the one thing I will say is that we're not rigid in the sense that a company has to make a payment request to us once a month. Obviously there can be ad hoc payments in between as well. So let's say to your example that you're on a £10 a month subscription, and then in one particular month you upgrade for an additional £5. There's a few different ways that you could do that through GoCardless. Number one is you just change the amount of the subscription. Or number two is if that's a one-off, you just kind of also do a one-off payment for that amount as well. That's kind of how we think.
Are you guys thinking about building a platform that will take that manual process out of the hand of the merchants and perhaps build it more automated in-house with you guys, or not at all?
So one of the things that we want to focus on really, and it's about focus. Like with every business, I think you can solve bigger problems by really focusing and specializing in a certain area. And the area where we think we can add the most value is helping people collect recurring payments, and not necessarily to move into a space of kind of helping people figure out the logic of their invoices and actually figuring out what is how much does this person get billed in this month versus how much do they get billed in the next month. Rather, we want to figure out what's the best way to collect that payment and in the most optimal way. And there's two things that's probably worth mentioning there as well, is that it doesn't mean that we don't think about that. And the way that we kind of think about that problem is that there are really strong companies who do that already. And we partner with them. So we partner with them and help people, use their platforms, and then they get a really, really easy and straightforward and simple kind of couple of clicks configuration to kind of set up GoCardless to collect those payments as well. And so we let the companies who are good at doing that do that, and we partner with them, and then we
focus on your strengths.
But at the same time, we do think about automation of our key pieces as much as possible. So Success Plus is a great example of that, right? Where instead of you as a merchant retrying your payment on dates that you think are acceptable or useful, we just take the whole thing out of your hands and say, these are the best days to retry. We're going to retry on these days, and then we'll let you know when it's successful. And that ultimately leads to something like a 15% improvement overall. Oh, wow. in the kind of the payment retry rates. And something like, I think on average, 76% of payments that fail are recovered through these retries, which is massive compared to
exactly
existing processes.
And that's for each payment.
Yeah,
I can imagine. Yeah, so indeed. Hey, one other thing that came to mind when we were talking is that hey, you guys are based from Back's debit system. But as well, we see a huge increase in the number of users of challenger banks. Do you guys see that as well in the bank accounts that are submitted to you guys? That there's a massive increase in those?
Yeah, certainly, especially as those challenger banks, became, less and less kind of wallets and actually proper challenger banks. Certainly, we saw that kind of mirrored in the types of accounts that sign up and as consumers and pay for things via GoCardless. Certainly saw that mirrored.
Because we as well
Although,
see,
yeah, it's
in the beginning, we saw that a lot of people were signing up, but like putting £50 in a bank account and just letting it sit right there and not really actively
yeah.
using the accounts. But I think there's an
And
interesting shift coming now.
Yeah, and that's the interesting part. So I think that's the additional bit is certainly at the start and still to a degree today is people weren't necessarily using those as their core current account, right? As you said, they were accounts they used when they went on holiday to begin with, which yes,
Guilty.
we then we wouldn't have exactly, we wouldn't have seen too many because people just don't have their being paid into them. They're not paying for their electricity out of them. Their kind of core payments aren't coming from them. But I think that's shifting now, certainly, and certainly with the friends and family around me that I see. More and more of them, anecdotally, are using challenger banks as their core current account, and that's kind of mirrored in some of the stats we see at GoCardless as well.
Cool. Hey, then looking towards the future, and let's keep it manageable the next 2 to 3 years. Any interesting developments that you see on the horizon that we can expect, either from GoCardless or industry wide?
And I assume when we say keep it focused, we mean around
Exactly.
payments, right? Because I could talk about a lot of things at once. Yeah, I mean, there's something I was thinking about recently. In fact, and talking about with a colleague, I think last week, about what do we see as a kind of a near-term trend, and have any of those trends changed, over the last few months? And I think that the biggest one that I can see in the near term, or you might say near to medium term, is probably the acceleration of the digitization of kind of B2B payments in particular. So the majority of kind of business to business transactions still seem to take place via kind of manual payment methods. So your bank transfers and your wire transfers that are pushed by the payer. And in some places, certainly, for example, in the US, we see you see something like 50 to 70% of business to business transactions still take place by check, right? So that's people writing a check and sending it. And I think that that those two things are always going to be kind of eroded away as people more and more kind of platforms and accounts receivable platforms and accounts payable platforms are all kind of digitized to a degree. There's going to be there was always going to be greater opportunities to kind of digitize those payments. However, I think over the last couple of months, I suspect we've seen some of that digitization accelerated as people take the opportunity to look at their kind of accounting processes and think, okay, well, are these the optimal ways of doing these transactions? Do we really need a human to kind of send money to our suppliers on a monthly basis? Do we need somebody to actually write? I mean, can I even write a check at the moment, right? Like, where is the check? Is it in my office? Like, who's got it? Who's got the the company credit card that I need to manually authorize each time? Those things have come into view, and I suspect we'll see that will be, I think, the biggest near-term change, alongside, I suspect, also on a related note, on the consumer side, the even quicker removal of cash from a lot of people's wallets and society generally.
Yeah, exactly. I think as well the digitalization of the B2B payments that you referred to. that could also lead to huge increases in insights in cash flow management for the companies. If indeed everything is digitalized, then you can optimize your cash flow performance a lot easier than currently possible indeed when writing checks, for instance.
Yeah, and I think it's got a few really core benefits. So on the certainly from a cash flow perspective, if you're for the seller, there's huge benefits there in terms of being in control of when you actually receive the funds. But I also think from a cost perspective for both parties, it could dramatically lower costs of operating their
Yeah.
businesses for the seller in terms of actually not having to manually reconcile everything and not having to kind of have resources dedicated to actually chasing some of your collections. These are huge kind of efficiency gains that can be gotten. You can divert a lot of that energy onto really more important projects. But even for the customer, if you're a business and you're having to manually send payments all the time, that's a cost. There's a very
Yeah.
real cost that you're kind of incurring in your business, and there's a lot of evidence out there that suggests that businesses that kind of remove that element save money first of all, but also have better supplier relations themselves. They're more likely to pay on time. Their invoices are more likely to be they're more likely to pay their invoices on time, which creates better relationships with their own suppliers
Yeah.
and ultimately helps them take advantage of kind of discounts from their perspective as well. So you've got a lot of cost benefit for both sides.
Exactly, and then I think we're coming full circle that indeed the automation on that part offers so many opportunities across the board that, yeah, I think that is the way forward. So
Mm.
I definitely agree there. All right, yeah, I think we covered a lot. I think a lot of food for thought. Any last thoughts that you want to leave us with?
The one thing that I think is really important is that certainly something that we focus on at GoCardless is just how do we use the intelligence that we actually have to help our kind of merchants kind of be more successful with their payments, right? So Success Plus is the first example of that from a product perspective, and we certainly see some great success in that already in terms of some of our early customers have almost halved their bad debt as a result of using Success Plus. And that's just purely based on the intelligence piece and then the automation piece. And we'll be certainly looking at additional products down the line that leverage that same intelligence to tackle other problems, problems maybe related to cash flow or problems related to fraud, for example. But I think there's another area as well where certainly we're starting to do more. Is that how do we use the intelligence that we have to help our customers operationally or help the market operationally understand the problems that they're having. So to help our customers figure out, okay, well, this is actually what an optimal payment failure rate looks like, or this is what an optimal conversion rate looks like. Here's what good looks like. Here's where you
Yeah.
are, and here's what you can do to improve that.
Benchmarking is always one of the main difficulties for merchants in specific niches, for instance. There's lack of data that to compare it to, but you
Yeah.
guys have the data.
Oh, precisely. And certainly one of the things that we think more about, I think a lot about at the moment is how do we actually operationalize that and make that useful for our customers, but for the market as a whole, how do we help the market get better at what they're doing? Because, ultimately, if we can get, people to be more successful with their recurring payments, then, hopefully we'll have done our jobs basically. So
Yeah.
yeah, that kind of benchmarking across a number of dimensions. Payment success is one, fraud rates is another, conversion rates is another, underlying cost for things like FX, that's another one. And there's a lot of complexity in the kind of the payments chain, and you can really help just by being super transparent about what reality is. And certainly at GoCardless, that's something we want to help our merchants with.
Yeah, exactly. Well, a few topics you mentioned that are indeed interesting, and we can devote entire podcast specifically to them. So, thank you very much for your time, Siamac. It's been a real pleasure having you as our guest, and hope to see you again soon, perhaps in the flesh once everything is ready post Corona, and perhaps we can touch upon those subjects as well.
Absolutely. It's been an absolute pleasure, Diederik. Thanks so much for having me. Really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. The Voices in Payments podcast is an initiative launched by Payment Genes, aimed at positively impacting the payments community by educating and connecting the market with vertical-specific industry expertise. We as Payment Genes empower the industry by focusing on the fundamentals for business growth. We achieve this by providing industry-leading payments recruitment, business and data strategy consulting services. Check out paymentgenes.com for more info and please follow us on social media for more jobs, company updates, industry insights, and more.